Emma Winch, je crois que vous pouvez nous rejoindre. On va vous entendre parler de cette expérience que vous menez depuis 8 ans dans un quartier londonien, le quartier de Hackney. Tout à l'heure, Neil MacGregor nous disait que les musées, historiquement, étaient d'abord des bibliothèques et des musées. C'est justement le cas du centre que vous dirigez, donc, qui est un centre qui a rouvert depuis 2003, qui est en même temps une bibliothèque et un musée. Vous allez nous expliquer les spécificités de ce lieu. C'est un musée pionnier en matière d'engagement communautaire et en matière de co-construction. Emma Winch, vous avez étudié d'abord le théâtre, même si vous pensez que ce n'est pas nécessaire de le dire. Vous avez aussi étudié la scénographie et puis la muséographie et l'éducation. Objets, mouvements, installations dans les espaces publics, extérieurs, intérieurs, décloisonnement, rencontres, récits, collaborations. Voilà, tout ça est au cœur de votre activité depuis 20 ans. Je vous laisse la parole.
Merci, je pense. Je vois. Bonjour, ça va? Sais-tu? I'm going to speak in English now because that's as far as I go. Okay, so good morning. I'm Emma Winch. I work for the London Borough of Hackney, where I'm responsible for engagement and development across Hackney's libraries, cultural services, and the council's museum and archive. I've worked for Hackney for 21 years, but for 17 of those, since 2003, I work solely for the museum and archives. And this is a picture here from a museum exhibition from a few years ago, which I thought was quite apt for the subject of the conference today. So my presentation today covers how the museum over 4 decades has documented community histories and more recently used our collections to work with communities to review, rename and reclaim public spaces. So in recent years, the debate in the UK around statues and naming, who we commemorate and how we commemorate, has been raging at a government, national and local authority level, and in universities, history lessons, communities and museums. In museums and archives, we hold the material for research, education and debate, and often we hold the solutions. And in Hackney, we found ourselves well placed to help shape conversations and to deliver consultations with communities, giving them a voice in the decisions we make about removing names and an agency to change things. So here's a picture taken back in the year 2000, just before when the new museum opened, of a young schoolchild in Hackney and the bust of Daniel Defoe, the esteemed author of Robinson Crusoe, but for whom slavery played a part in more than one aspect of his life, in his literary works, but also as a stockholder in the South Sea Company, which held the right to supply enslaved African people to the Spanish colonies in the Americas. A much celebrated resident of Hackney in the 1700s, Daniel Defoe's bust stands in Hackney Museum. So these are legacies we've been grappling with in the museum for 2 decades. Coming to light first in 2007, the bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, of which Britain played a big part, and continuing through our work in partnership with University College London since 2014 to engage African and African communities in a project to digitise UK slave compensation records and to map the links to slave ownership across the UK. Using the database, you can view records of everyone that applied for compensation when slavery was abolished. Using the database, you can search by your town, the road you live on, and the house you live in. You can search surnames, political constituencies at the time, and at the time of the project, our Prime Minister and his wife both showed up in the database as having family links to plantations in both Jamaica and St. Lucia. Interestingly, 40% of claims in the records were filed by women. And you'll have to take my word for it because the slide that's showing that project is missing. But if you can search, it's a UK database, but you can find it very easily online. So Hackney's links to transatlantic slavery are extensive. At one point, Hackney was largely owned by Thyssen, Cass and Aske, who you can see here. And we are also home to the Jeffrey Museum, now called the Museum of the Home. All 4 of these gentlemen invested in the Royal African Company and or the East India Company. and brought huge wealth and prosperity to Hackney through enslavement and the trading of African people. The compensation records show us that 23 people in Hackney, including women, filed for compensation. You can see the location of the plantation that they owned, how much they were compensated for their loss, and how many enslaved African people they owned. Between 2007 and 2020, our work with UCL to map Hackney and to involve communities in uncovering the history and embedding it in school curriculums has been uncomfortable, painful, and slow. But in 2020, as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement and the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol, in the UK, everything changed and the spotlight was thrown onto Hackney Museum and our work in this area. So Edward Colston was a wealthy Bristol merchant during the late 17th century. For many years, like Aske, Cass, Geoffrey and Tyson, he was celebrated as a philanthropist with schools and public buildings in the city named after him. And in 1895, a statue was raised in the city to commemorate him. He profited greatly through the trafficking of enslaved Africans, and throughout the 20th century, there have been calls for the statue to be removed. In recent decades, it has been at the centre of protests and interventions, until, perhaps almost inevitably, the statue became the focal point of a Black Lives Matter protest on the 7th of June, where it was pulled down, thrown into the sea, and later recovered and moved to the city's museum. Now, Bristol is outside London, which you can see over here. It's a more rural area, but like Hackney, the city also has significant African and African Caribbean communities due to its location as a port town and the key role Bristol merchants played in the transatlantic slave trade. Hackney is 200 kilometres away in the east end of London, but we have our own contested statue. Since the toppling of the Colston statue, the Geoffrey Museum, an independent national and international museum in Hackney, has been through a huge redevelopment, which has involved changing the name to the Museum of the Home and creating a new entrance and turning its back on the old entrance, which you can see here, to the museum, where the statue of Robert Geoffrey looks out over a Hackney housing estate that bears the same name. The call to remove the statue has been supported by Hackney Council's politicians who attended protests alongside constituents, campaigners and communities. And here's a photograph of that estate. So the Geoffrey statue is in Haggerston, which is the third most deprived ward in Hackney, and has higher levels of African and African Caribbean residents than anywhere else in the borough. So when you have people of African and African Caribbean descent living in the estates and roads that commemorate slave traders, it makes it a very complex environment to start talking about power and naming. And this is particularly complex in Hackney Council, in Hackney Museum, which is a small, free community museum. It's used by all 54 primary schools in Hackney, and it serves all communities. I'll paint a little picture of Hackney for you. So Hackney has a population of 265,000 people, which I understand is about the same size as the city of Geneva, I learnt last night. It's only a few kilometres wide, it's not very big. Only 30% of people in Hackney are white British. Hackney is one of the most deprived areas in the UK, though it is on the up. It's currently 18th out of 151. And life expectancy is worse than the rest of London. 25% of children and 41% of adults aged 60 plus live in income-deprived households, and child poverty is worse than the London average. However, it is now one of the most expensive places to live in the UK due to gentrification. And this photograph, which you can't see the caption for, it's jiggled around. This photograph here was taken just up the road in Woodbury Down, which is the most deprived ward in Hackney, where it's common for a family home to cost in excess of £1 million, but the living standards and housing are extremely poor. And this photograph paints a very good picture of Hackney now and over the centuries, a place of extreme wealth and extreme deprivation. And this little diagram here shows you the worst performing councils and the better performing on the outside. So you can see it's very low on most accounts. And Hackney, you can see, is right in the heart of that very deep, deep red in the middle of London, where it's incredibly expensive to own a home. So, and I think it's important to give you context to Hackney, because it's a very small museum in a very specific place. So what communities do we have? So 47% of the population come from Black and global majority groups. We have the largest Haredi Orthodox Jewish community outside New York and Israel. 40% of births last year in Hackney were from Haredi Jewish families who have an average of 6 to 7 children. The Haredi community was established in the 1920s in the north of the borough, growing significantly during the Second World War as new arrivals fled the Holocaust. Hackney has a well-established Turkish and Kurdish-speaking community. Turkish is the second highest spoken language in the borough. It's Turkish people who arrived from the 1930s and again for both political and economic reasons in the 70s and 80s. And our Kurdish communities who fled persecution in Turkey, Iraq and Iran in large numbers in the 80s and early 90s. 9% are Caribbean, and we have a very diverse Caribbean community compared to other areas of the UK. People are from Antigua, Jamaica, St. Lucia and Dominica, who moved mainly during the 60s and 70s after World War II. Hackney was also a main settlement for refugees from Montserrat who were displaced after the volcano in 1995. 11% are from African countries and began arriving in large numbers in the 1960s, and again from the 1980s from Nigeria, Biafra, Ghana, Congo, Senegal, Sierra Leone and Uganda. In the 1950s and 60s, many people from South Asia began arriving in Hackney, and 10% of Hackney's population were recorded in the census as being Bangladeshi, Indian or Pakistani. Hackney's Vietnamese population arrived after 1975, when the UK government accepted quotas of refugees from camps in Hong Kong under a planned resettlement scheme. Half the population are under 35 years old, and almost a third are under 24, so it's a very young borough. Hackney has the second lowest number of straight and heterosexual people, and residents are more likely to identify as bisexual or queer compared to any other London borough. 1.1% said their gender is different to their sex registered at birth, which is higher than the London and national average. And Hackney has a higher proportion of bisexual, pansexual and queer residents than the rest of the UK. So it's an incredibly diverse and interesting place to live. And historically, it's been a place for refugees, migrants, campaigners, creatives, activists and outcasts to find a home from home and a sense of community. And though 45% think Hackney has become a more unequal borough, 90% still think Hackney is a place where people from different backgrounds get along well together. And the same amount think it's important for people from different backgrounds to mix with each other. So, a bit of context. Back to the museum. So Hackney Museum, as you can see, is a very small museum. It doesn't go much further back than what you can see in this picture. It's the Community History Museum for the London Borough of Hackney. We're funded by the local council, which is funded by the government. We have to work hard to make sure our museum is relevant to local communities and good value for money for the Borough Council. We care for over 8,500 objects, artworks, images and oral history recordings. And our collections represent the everyday lives of people in the borough. And we use these collections to engage and empower local people to tell their own stories, to share their concerns about local issues that are rooted in a historical context, and understand how their experiences fit alongside others. And the story starts with Anglo-Saxon migration from Germany, Denmark and Sweden to Hackney over 1,000 years previously. And the idea that we are all migrants, it just depends how far back you go. Is everything okay? Pardon? Pause for a minute. Okay. I will wait until the translation starts again. Do I need to go back or are we good? Cool. Okay. So it starts, we have a long history of migration as we do everywhere in the world, and we're very lucky to have the Anglo-Saxon boat, which you can see being lowered into the ground It's under the ground, under that glass as you come into the museum, which symbolises to people that that's the start of Hackney's rich migration history. And then the narrative of the museum follows on with the different reasons why people have settled in Hackney over time and how different communities have helped to shape Hackney today. And we've been working in an engaged way with local communities to collect, preserve and share diverse histories in Hackney for the last 20 years. So we have extensive collections of African Caribbean community campaign material. So the material on the top left is related to the deaths of young black men in police custody during the 1980s and the 1990s. We have material about community organising, material about protest, African Caribbean hair and music, which played a huge role in the world stage. And also this book down here, which was one of my favourite objects in the whole of the museum, this poetry collection by Vivian Usherwood, who was a student at a Hackney school. He was excluded from school when he was 13, but a lovely teacher persuaded him to write down his poems because he was very talented at poetry. And it was published by a local publisher in Hackney called Centerprise. It was the first book they ever published, and it sold 8,000 copies in its first week. But the people that bought the copies were the teachers in the Hackney schools that didn't have the material to teach young boys. So that's a fantastic story. We have collections we have a fantastic badge collection, so lots of campaign and activism badges. We've got documents of the lesbian squats in Hackney, women coming together, disillusioned with the gay solidarity campaigns and setting up on their own to campaign for abortion rights, reproduction rights, anti-nuclear. And this is Hannah Snell, who lived her life in the 1750s as a man in Hackney. And then broader communities and the objects that they've given us. So we have objects from the Jewish community in the main museum. We have one of the first printing presses that printed in Yiddish. We have photographs and articles from our Cambodian communities. This is an image from the Ayers house, which used to be on Mare Street in Hackney, which was a home for Indian nannies in Hackney. We have objects from the Turkish and Kurdish community, including this Saz up here. From a traveller community, we have a significant traveller community too. And we have these suitcases that we've created with people in Hackney's communities to tell their migration stories, which I'll come on to in a little while. So the museum opened, as I said, in 2003 with a grant from the National Heritage Lottery Fund. And we've used those collections from the 80s and 90s in the displays. So as you go around the museum, you can see these stories from people and groups popping out at you. This is a section about Hackney as a safe haven and the reasons why people came to Hackney, because it was safer than where they were coming from. We use the collections in our schools programme. So here we've got images of young children in Hackney exploring the lives of people that have migrated to Hackney, including Martha Immerdauer, who was a young Jewish child who came on the Kindertransport train to escape Nazi Germany. And this is Mohammed's sculpture. So Mohammed was a young lad who came to Hackney from Sierra Leone. During the Civil War, he moved with his family and he shared his story with the museum, which you can see, well, you can't see, but above that telephone is Mohammed's story, and also the story of Than Vu, who's hugely influential in Hackney's community. We've used the objects and material to help tell community stories about all the different communities we have in Hackney. So specific exhibitions about Eastern, Central and Southern African communities, Cambodian families and their stories. But we also come up with themes for exhibitions so that we can present shared experiences of the same theme. So we did a lovely exhibition about being a mum in Hackney and what that means to people from all over the world who are a mum in Hackney. We do exhibitions about food and about trade and business so that different people can feed in. And the exhibition on the top left, The Golden Age of Social Housing, it focused in on one tower block and all the different people and stories from that one tower block. So you can imagine that painted a picture of the world just in that one tower block. There's a great power in telling your own stories, but there's also a great power in hearing other people's stories too. And here are some of the things people have said about discovering other people's migration stories. So I didn't realise other communities had suffered in the way that our families and parents had suffered. And this was an Orthodox Jewish resident hearing about the experiences of refugees from Biafra and Sierra Leone in the 70s and 90s. I didn't realise other people felt so alienated when they arrived. The alienation is why our community bonded so strongly too. This was a Cambodian resident hearing about the experience of Windrush migrants from the Caribbean who settled in Hackney in the 1950s. And over the decades, we've been learning about the power of names. We were forced to change, we were forced to leave, and we all changed our names too. This was a Kurdish resident quite recently hearing about an Orthodox Jewish refugee's experience in 1940. The African people who had their names taken away from them when they were enslaved would have had broken spirits. This was a quote from a child when they were learning about Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa as he was named, an African child who was enslaved and taken from Nigeria in the 1700s and whose daughter is buried in Abney Park Cemetery in Hackney. I live on Caslan Road. I've lived on a road named after a slave trader my whole life, and I didn't know it until today. It feels so wrong. A young Caribbean resident learning the history of the name of her road. I'll come back to that. There's a power in using collections, in learning different strategies that people have employed in the past to have your own voice heard. These young lads, a brilliant group of young lads who were getting into trouble in the museum and the library upstairs, they just had nothing to do and they weren't welcome anywhere. They kept getting sent home if they were in their school uniform because they were giving the school a bad reputation. We work with them on different ways over time that people have come together, or young people particularly have come together to have their voice heard. So Vivian Usherwood, who had his poetry published, and that was poetry specifically about being a young Caribbean lad in Hackney. 300 children coming together to march on Whitehall against racial hatred, and amazing stories of entrepreneurism, people that have said, there isn't the hair product that I need in this country, I'm going to invent it, make my own, and then earn $1 million. So all these different ways that you create your own support networks and have your voice heard. They ended up writing songs, which are absolutely amazing. We presented them in an exhibition, and they also wrote a letter to the Prime Minister at the time, and they were responded to, which I'm quite pleased with. And the significance of that is that these 300 children from Hackney youth clubs had a letter, a protest letter, and they marched in a silent march from Hackney all the way to Whitehall to present this letter. So it was kind of in that spirit. Power in using history to challenge the present. So that African Caribbean collection, again, we use it a lot. So this was in sessions, we've had a specific programme, a 10-year theory of change programme in Hackney about improving outcomes for young black men. We use the material with them, with youth workers and the police, to have conversations about extremely challenging tensions between different communities and the police. And we found that using this material to discuss issues that are very prevalent now, but through a historical lens, because this is a pattern in history, it removes the participants from the current trauma so they can have more, less traumatic conversations and more productive conversations about solutions, rather than getting stuck in the trap of, well, you don't understand me, you treat me differently, and the police going, well, you should act like this, behave like this. So it allowed everyone to step out of their role and think kind of in the second person about solutions. They went on to become Hackney Account. They've carried on collecting their own oral histories from people in the community. They've put on community exhibitions, and they now use all of their research to train the police, challenge the police, hold them to account, and work with them so that they have a better relationship with young people in Hackney. Project Indigo, we're a group of young LGBTQIA people who accessed a counselling service in Hackney, and we've worked with them multiple times over the last decade. We used our collections with them to explore the gaps in our history, the gaps in our LGBT history in Hackney. We worked with them to fill them in. We talked about omissions in collections and why they exist. And the young people came together to create, we thought initially they'd create a piece of work about themselves and their own identities, but in the end they came together to create a piece of work about the trans members of the group, because through that work that we were doing over the weeks with them, they realised that actually out of all the group, they were suffering the most within the group, they were the most misunderstood or struggling to be understood. So they came together to support the trans members of the group. We worked with graffiti artist Stick, who designed Holding Hands for us all to take to Pride. It was the first time Hackney Council and community groups had a collective presence at Pride in London, the centre of London. And we later got funding to have the sculpture turned into, the artwork turned into a permanent sculpture which stands in Hoxton Square in South Hackney. One of the interesting things about these groups, and I know you'll find it from working with marginalised groups in your museums, is that the conversation rarely stays on topic. So they come to group every week and they talk about the experience they'd had the previous day of wanting to go to the new leisure centre but not feeling like they could because they didn't know where to get change, there wasn't anywhere for them. All of the barriers that they faced using other council services. So in the background to that project, I was speaking to people who were leading these huge change projects in Hackney to get them to consult with those young people to change the designs or to consider their needs within the new designs. And so now we have a new outdoor swimming pool, which you can see at the bottom, which has gender-neutral training. The same for Britannia Leisure Centre, which is a huge leisure centre for Hackney. That has gender-neutral changing rooms too. We also have spaces. We have closed session for Orthodox Jewish users of the swimming pool, because whatever you feel about difference, having access to exercise is incredibly important for mental health. And if we have to work with our communities to make sure that they can access our facilities. One of the most challenging groups to work with in Hackney are our Orthodox Jewish community. Back in the 90s, we worked with Rabbi Pinter, who was a very significant rabbi in the community. We collected his story, which you can hear in the museum. That very early relationship with Rabbi Pinter meant that we started to develop a very trusted relationship with this community who separate themselves very much from the rest of Hackney. In 2016, I worked with 60 young Jewish teenagers, which was a massive privilege. I taught them oral history and I got them to go home and interview their grandparents. So this was the first time we had access to females, to women's oral histories. And so one of the women during the oral history remembered that she had a little red bag in her loft which had a little German mark in it, and she had not thought about it since she arrived in Hackney. So her family got the little red bag down. She said she'd hidden the German mark in her shoe when she came because everybody had everything that was worth anything stolen. But this was the first time it had come out, and you can see it displayed in the museum there, which is a huge, huge progression to have, the Jewish communities in the museum in such great numbers, but also to be trusted with their very precious objects. So they did an exhibition. And this year as well, it's quite exciting, we've named a significant road in Hackney after Rabbi Pinter, who was a more progressive rabbi than some of the others and helped us access that community. Have I skipped one? No? This is my favourite project of recent years. This is Braffa Square, which is outside that massive leisure centre that I just spoke about. So when we created the leisure centre, they created this new public space outside, and they asked me to try and find a new name for the square. So we used all the names and all the histories that we've been collecting over the years to come up with a naming shortlist. We also accepted suggestions from members of the public, and one member of the public remembered this concert that happened in 1986 in this park next to the leisure centre. And it was a benefit gig that British reggae artists had come together in Hackney to record their own version of the Live Aid singles. They created their own song. They looked at Live Aid and said, where are we? Where are all the African Caribbean artists who are raising money for the Ethiopian famine? So they did it themselves. They recorded the album in Hackney with Eddie Grant's permission. They used his studio. And in 2021, we brought them all back together to celebrate the opening of Braffa Square, which we're really, really proud. The public voted for it. That's the other thing. We sent the shortlist out, and the public voted for it. And Braffa means the British Reggae Artists Famine Appeal Team. Something that's really significant in this work that's unexpected is about having people's faces in the public realm and not just names, because names don't necessarily mean anything to people. But this is the first time that we started having those discussions about actually putting photographs and people's faces into these spaces. This work is joyous and wonderful. It's amazing to be able to give these fantastic people in Hackney's history the recognition they deserve for the significant impact that they've made on world history, on world music, on fashion, and the work they're doing with the police. It's amazing that these projects have had a legacy beyond the museum walls. But this kind of brings us back to the harder work that I started talking about at the beginning, where I'm really going to regret not having my notes because I had lots of really important points to make. But this work about what we do with the names that communities have told us actively cause them harm and trauma. So this isn't about getting people into the museum for a debate about the issue. This is about really coming to terms with the fact that in Hackney we have young people living on streets named by slave traders and using parks named by slave traders, or living in the Jeffrey estate, and how problematic that is. So in 2020, when the statue was toppled, we were actually in quite a strong place in Hackney because we'd done all of that research. We'd mapped Hackney, we'd found out where all the problematic places were, whereas a lot of other parts of the UK had to start doing that research in their archives. There was a huge amount of pressure put on archives at that time. We already had that material, so we could focus on the really hard, difficult and slow work, which was about community healing and talking to people about what they wanted us to do. Of course, public education is a huge part of the project. So when we started looking at some of these different sites, we created information packs about the person who the site was named after, because we didn't want these decisions to be made without education and without people making informed decisions. So in 2020, we went out with a consultation, a public consultation, where we asked everybody that lived around the park to vote for a new name for Caston Road Gardens. This was something that was supported by Hackney politicians as part of their anti-racism commitment following Black Lives Matter. And the residents that lived around Caston Road Gardens voted for Kit Crowley Gardens. And Kit Crowley was a nursery worker who lived in the housing estate next to the park. People were delighted to be able to vote for somebody that really represented Hackney values. That's what they told us. In the gardens, we have an interpretation panel which tells the story of Kit. It kind of forefronts her story, but it does also tell the story of Sir John Cass, and it explains the project and the work that went on so that we can really kind of capture this moment in time, which is something the public told us that they really wanted us to do. They didn't want us just to erase this history. That's so problematic. But we could reframe it by renaming it and then explaining it with a new name. And this is the most recent park that we've renamed, Joe White Gardens. Askey Gardens, Askey was one of the four that we looked at. Joe White went to school in Hackney. He had a huge impact on Hackney. He was a basketball coach, and he used to go around to all the secondary schools and work with all the boys that needed some basketball training, and the girls, actually, I was told. He used to teach in the old Britannia Leisure Centre, which we've seen the new one in the slideshow today. But Askey Gardens is actually a basketball park, so it was a really lovely name to be able to give to that park. And back to the museum to finish. So I'm really excited to say that we've been given more funding to create a new museum. So museums typically have a lifespan of about 20 years. As you know, ours looks very tired. And I know I said come along and listen to the telephones with people talking, but most of them don't work, so don't. Maybe wait a couple of years, because we're going to be opening a brand new museum that tells the story of Hackney beyond 2003, which is where it stops. And you'll see from some of these visualisations of the new museum, some of the subjects that I talked about here, and some of the fantastic people that will be represented in the new museum. And I had a much better ending to my presentation than this with my notes. I'm very sorry. But let's end there. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Emma Winch. On va ouvrir les questions. Comme ça, vous pouvez prendre le casque pour entendre les questions en anglais traduit. Est-ce qu'il y a des mains qui se lèvent? Est-ce qu'il y a des micros qui circulent? Alors là-bas, il y a une main. Ici, il y en a une juste sur notre gauche. On vous écoute.
Est-ce que je la pose en français ou en anglais?
Comme ça vous sied.
It's working.
Okay, I try to to ask in English. So thank you very much for your... I'm Roberta Colombo-Dugbu, curator of Oceania Collection here at the Meg. Thank you very much for your presentation, really interesting, and give also another perspectives of what a museum can be. But there is something that I would like to investigate with you, because you give a fantastic perspective. I was wondering if there are conflicts, because between the communities, between the narratives. I would be interested in hearing something about the hidden part of the scene, let's call it like this. Thank you very much.
Is the microphone? Yes, it's on. I'll answer in English and hopefully you can hear the translation. So we have the permanent displays in the museum, which tell the different migration stories of people that have come to Hackney. We then have a temporary exhibition space, and we have 3 new exhibitions a year and a pop-up space. So we do have very contrasting narratives. I think the exhibition about trans young people was before the Jewish young women's exhibition. But what we find is, because we have that programme running alongside the main displays, it's very easy to explain to people that, yes, this is our or how this group represent themselves and their story, but this space is then going to be filled with your story, and it's really important that you tell your story in this space where so many people are going to encounter it. And we find that brings people on side, particularly the Orthodox Jewish community, who close themselves off so much, but are really keen to talk about their community and culture and to get people to understand them a little bit more. So they're very receptive to working in partnership, despite the fact that we've got big trans placards. I don't know how we do it, but we do. And right at the beginning, so 15 years ago, when I first started having Jewish primary schools in the museum, I did cover the things in the museum that they didn't want to see. So any pictures of women's arms that were bare, I would cover them up, because I just thought, for the greater good, it's better to get the kids into the museum and do what they say, so that we can build that relationship. At least we can get them out of that community and into our community. So I think by working with people and being really flexible, being able to earn people's trust, that not everything that they see in the museum is something they're going to agree with, but it's definitely going to be the truth and presented in a way that's from people and not in a way that's being curated by anybody else, but right from those communities. And we do often have clashes side by side of different opinions, but it's a platform for people to share those opinions. We very much see it as that. We know it's very political what we do in the museum. But I think people welcome that, even if it's not always something that they're in favour of. The other thing is that we have a road in Hackney where you've got a synagogue and the mosque right next to each other, and the rabbi and the imam have quite a good, or quite a sensible relationship. And actually, when we've done projects with school children before, we have across community, we found that the Jewish schools and the Muslim schools prefer to work together than with mainstream schools, because they know that even though they're completely opposed on the other side of the world, this is not now, this is 10 years ago, but still kind of opposed on the other side of the world. In that space, they think that those young people are going to be as respectful of religion and tradition. They'd rather work with them than they would with mainstream kids from mainstream schools. So the museum becomes a very interesting place when you're inviting everybody in at the same time.
Merci.
Thank you. This is Jose from Culture Inquiry. Thank you, Emma, for this amazing presentation. It's so inspiring. A couple of very specific questions. The first one is this lovely story of the 300 children, how they were engaged in the museum. Have they something, some relation with the museum, some kind of engagement in some program? And the second one, very, in this new phase of the museum, you have demanding out the role of the community. In terms of decisions making, how to spend the money, how to distribute, how to create the strategy. So do you see that it is evolving the role of the community from the decolonization role to another power role in terms of museum? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to explain, sorry, the detail was in my notes, but that newspaper article about the 300 children, that's from the past. I think it's from 1967, and it was kids coming together at Ridley Road Market in Hackney, which is it was formerly a Jewish market, but it's now known as an African Caribbean market, but they came together from the youth clubs and marched. So it was the youth clubs from across Hackney coming together and working together. And we were just lucky to come across that newspaper article, which I used in 50% of school sessions from that point that I found it. Like those golden items that you have in your collection that you get out every time because they tell such incredible stories. Using that as a springboard for so many different projects, because it's an example of how young people navigated racism in the past. Also, when you go into that article, you can see that a lot of those kids are white kids. And so we've been able to have a debate about how the white British communities in the past were a lot more supportive of campaigns, a lot braver to go out and have their say against racism. When you look at photographs of protests against the death of young black men in Hackney, they were huge and they involved the whole community came out in solidarity, whereas now it's very much an us and a them problem in Hackney. In some ways it's worse. We're less brave to kind of stand beside people. So the conversations that you can have when you start looking at that, because I think it's often felt that the onus is on those communities to fix it with the police, but actually in the past there was much more support to ensure that people kind of got along well. And then just to say very quickly on your second question about the museum, the new museum, we're very lucky actually. I was very lucky when I started in 2003 because the previous museum that we have now was set up with community collection panels. So people were given a budget and they were worked with us for many, many months. It was just before I started in the museum. And they collected objects and contributed oral histories which were then displayed in the museum. So now we're refreshing the museum. We're revisiting that model that we used previously, which I think is a different situation to a lot of museums who are having to kind of start to map that out. But it's changed a lot. In the first iteration, it was working with the African community, the Vietnamese community, and everybody, they had their own kind of collecting panels, but now it's very much mixed steering groups, mixed panels, rather than that. That's one of the learnings that we've had, is it's not how we don't put people into a community and tell them that they're going to define themselves in this way. So the groups are much more mixed and arranged differently this time around.